Well, recent events in the Middle East mean that Ukraine is no longer the current thing. It has fallen out of favor with the press, which is quite strange. So the political class is still making signals saying that we are unwaveringly committed to victory in Ukraine, even if the war isn't going quite as well as Zelensky and they would have hoped. But some of the press are throwing Zelensky under the bus. It's an unprecedented move. I can only imagine it's tactical in some way, shape, or form. Thought we'd just look at those articles today and examine exactly why the war isn't going as well as they'd hoped and what they stand to gain by making Zelensky no longer out to be the great hero and defender of democracy, as we have been told he is for the last 2 years. So, speaking of the tragedy of a statesman, if you'd like to subscribe to our website, as little as £5 a month, you get a lot of our premium content, including Status's series, Symposium, where one of the latest episodes was him, Josh, and Bo going through Oedipus. So marry your mum and sleep with her and kill your dad. I mean, hard moral messages to follow, I suppose. And if you'd like to watch our content for a discount, turns out, because it's our 3rd birthday recently, we've got you a discount code of up to 33% off if you use the code BIRTHDAY at checkout. That's for the new subscribers. So go over, join the family. You're welcome. Anyway, so just looking over onto what's happened recently, David Cameron, obviously appointed now a Baron. I think he's Baron Chipping Norton, so poor Jeremy Clarkson. And he's now the Foreign Secretary because the Tories ran out of ideas again. And they just wanted to abandon any pretense. They were pro-Brexit. But hey-ho, he went over to Zelensky, shook his hand, did the old "we stand with Ukraine" nonsense. Meanwhile, the general lay press are throwing him under the bus. There's this giant Time magazine piece. I'm going to read a few extracts from it. And it's quite insightful because they spoke to members of Zelensky's own government who'd rather stay anonymous, saying, we kind of think he's gone mad. And actually, there's loads of money laundering going on. And yeah, our bad guys. It really has been lining the pockets of corrupt politicians. Do you know all those things that conspiracy theorists were saying ages ago? Turns out they're all true. So, 20 months into the war, about a fifth of Ukraine's territory remains under Russian occupation. Tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians have been killed, and Zelensky can feel during his travels that global interest in the war has slackened, so has the level of international support. I just want to put a point there that quite a while ago when Jack Teixeira, who was the whistleblower, who had leaked loads of internal documents from the US saying actually the territory gains and casualties are slightly higher and faring slightly worse than thought. Everyone that looked at that and said, oh, is that legitimate? Again, called a conspiracy theorist. He was arrested by the feds. Turns out that now Time magazine are totally fine to publish basically the same thing. All right, just putting it out there. We're not moving forward, says one of Zelensky's close aides. Some frontline commanders, he continues, have begun refusing orders to advance, even when they came directly from the office of the president. They just want to sit in the trenches and hold the line, he says. We can't win a war that way. Since the start of the invasion, Ukraine has refused to release official counts of dead and wounded, but according to US and European estimates, the toll has long surpassed 100,000 on each side of the war. And so this slow progress means, and the recent midterm election and ousting of Kevin McCarthy means, that there is pressure from specifically the Republican side of the House to rescind support for Ukraine. Some 41% of Americans want Congress to provide more weapons to Kyiv, down from 65% in June, so 24% drop-off. At the end of last year, during his previous visit to Washington, Zelensky received a hero's welcome. The White House sent a US Air Force jet to pick him up in eastern Poland a few days before Christmas. But then, that evening, Zelensky appeared before a joint session of Congress to declare that Ukraine had defeated Russia in the Battle of Minds of the World. This time around, the most recent state visit, the atmosphere had changed. Assistance to Ukraine had become a sticking point in the debate over the federal budget on the causes for the shutdown. One of Zelensky's foreign policy advisors urged him to call off a trip in September, warning the atmosphere was too fraught. Congressional leaders declined to let Zelensky deliver a public address on Capitol Hill. His aides tried to arrange an in-person appearance from him on Fox News and an interview with Oprah Winfrey. Neither one came through. Nobody wants to talk to him at primetime. Doesn't seem he has many friends left. May have something to do with the optics blunder of when his last visit to Canada meant that everyone got implicated in applauding for a literal Nazi.
Certain organization, which I won't say because I'll start laughing again at how ridiculous it was.
Yeah. If you want to keep your career, maybe vet your guests in future. But
fight the SS to a certain... But anything, really. I don't know why that's good ideas ever to invite the SS to your meetings, but hey-ho.
Yep, there you go.
Especially by people who claim to find the far-right people everywhere in their societies.
Yes. Yeah, doesn't lend too much credibility to Trudeau, but then again, his dad may or may not be Fidel Castro. So instead, on the morning of September the 21st, Zelensky met in private with then Emphasis on the then House Speaker Kevin McCarthy before making his way to the old Senate chamber. They asked me straight up, if we don't give you the aid, what happens? Zelensky recalls. What happens is we will lose. One of Zelensky's close aides tells me, the author of this piece, that even if the US and its allies came through with all the weapons they had pledged, we still don't have the men to use them. And I have seen videos circulating recently that look like a large cohort of older men being included in the draft. And so it seems that they're running out of younger and more able conscripts as the war goes on. So it doesn't bode well for their efforts to defend what parts of their country don't want to actively secede, like the Donbass regions. Also, his character might be affecting the prospect of a resolution. This is from inside sources, so not just me making it up on the fly. Zelensky's convictions haven't changed. Despite the recent setbacks on the battlefield, he doesn't intend to give up fighting or to sue for any kind of peace. On the contrary, his belief in Ukraine's ultimate victory over Russia has hardened into a form that worries some of his advisors. It is immovable, verging on the messianic. Quote, he deludes himself, one of his closest aides tells me in frustration. We're out of options, we're not winning, but try telling him that. Zelensky's stubbornness, some of his aides say, has hurt their team's efforts to come up with a new strategy, a new message. As they have debated the future of the war, one issue has remained taboo, the possibility of negotiating a peace deal with the Russians. Judging by recent surveys, most Ukrainians would reject such a move, especially if it entailed the loss of any occupied territory. So, there is, of course, the argument that he's representing Ukrainian interests. They don't want to cede any ground. They should be more than happy to prolong the fight and continue it on. But if there's not a realistic prospect of victory, if your allies aren't willing to front any more of the money and ammunitions, how are you going to fight the war and win it? And when even his closest aides are starting to sound like Russia today, doesn't bode well for Ukrainian morale.
Well, I must say here, and I'm judging this just from the political side, that obviously what he's doing makes sense from the perspective of his own interests. Because if you're fighting a war, you don't just go out and you say, I believe I'm going to lose.
Yes.
So what he does makes sense to me in that sense.
But the realism of that actually happening.
Well, what does winning or losing look like for either side here? Because this is something that's really undefined for everyone.
Yes.
I mean, as someone who's been to Donbass, I went and met Russian people as well in Moscow, who were serious people, and they don't even know what victory looks like for them exactly. They've got some minimums they'd want to achieve. It's going to be grounds, ceded and annexed. But they're nowhere near any point where they could sign a deal, really, because they don't know what they're doing. The Ukrainians don't know what they're doing. The objective is obviously to retake all the ground they've lost, but modern warfare doesn't seem to be possible for either of these two militaries. They're not able to do anything that NATO can do. And instead, as well, they mentioned, everyone's stuck in trench warfare, celebrating taking a balcony every week. Oh, hurrah, we have taken yet another balcony. Okay, cool. In which case, I think this is probably going to be one of those wars that goes on for ages, years and years.
I agree with you. Yeah.
I remember when this started, I remember Daisy texted me, be like, God, I wish this is going to be over in a year or something. I was like, no, this is going to be 10 years at the minimum. Because regardless of what victory or defeat looks like for either one, outright victory, capitulation of one side isn't going to happen. So instead, I think you're probably right that Zelensky, if he sits there, keep talking, even privately, publicly, of course, you've got to give the line, but privately, that they're going to retake all this land. Good luck. It's not happening. So,
well, the necessary concessions essentially have to be to allow the Donbass regions to secede to Russia and give up Crimea.
Depends on the Russian you're speaking to. For them, basically, Crimea is a non-conversation. That is Russian land.
Yep.
For Donbass, they should be allowed to join Russia. But then there's debate about how much more should be allowed to join Russia. And then you get into the people who just think, no, let's just keep going forever. Why not?
Yeah.
We've got more men, more money, more material.
Some won't be content with just not having Ukraine join NATO. It will be, we need to take all of the Ukrainian landmass. So,
or there's the opposition position, which is the not the Russian opposition, but the opposite position, where you just say, just keep the war going forever. It's actually good for everyone involved. It's good for America. It's good for Europe. It's good for Russia in a way. It means that Ukraine will never join NATO. And it's bad for everyone who's dying, but when has that ever mattered?
And also it depletes the Western reserves if they keep supporting Zelensky, because we've cut on those off to spite our face by sanctioning Russia, whereas Russia is joining the parallel economic alliance of BRICS, and so they've got lots of gold, gas, and plentiful mineral resources to keep them going when our energy policy means that we're out of cheap energy.
Yeah, I mean, they've got their own problems too. It's not a perfect fix, but it's not something that's going to make them go offline anytime soon. So I don't really know what the future of this conflict is. I mean, if this goes on for another 5 years, Zelensky can't stay in power. which case we'll get someone else and this will just go on and on and on.
Well, I think he'll try to stay in power because obviously he's gotten rid of lots of opposition parties. He's banned lots of opposing journalists. He's persecuted the church when they tried to say, well, maybe we should call to some kind of ceasefire deal over this. So I do think he wants to retain power. But I think it's whether or not the Western allies, as we're sort of seeing here, think that he's the man to keep in power. Because they helped appoint him in the first place. Is he looking more like a liability than a safe asset now?
But there's also the issue of prestige. I think that the Western allies, I don't think they're going to let it this way. So I think you're correct. It's going to be a war of attrition for a long time.
Well, it's good news for the West. I mean, NATO can sit here and weaken its geopolitical rival without having to do much except burn money, which is what we do every day.
Yeah, but there's also the other issue that if you could see that the election of Biden, for instance, may have been interpreted by several sides as a sign of weakness.
Yes.
And this triggered 2 wars. So the question is, if these wars are successful for the other side, this is going to be a really bad image for NATO and the Western allies.
And it's also going to accelerate the rate at which...
I don't know to what extent there is the idea that the new Republicans, if they win the 2024 election, will do something significantly different there. I personally don't believe that.
I think it's also contingent on the US withdrawing almost all of its funding. And it is interesting that Time Magazine almost seems to be pushing them in that direction. When Time Magazine, I mean, don't forget everyone, they were the one that published the article that said the shadow campaign that saved the 2020 election with fortification. So they're not exactly on the side of the Republicans that are saying, don't provide any more funding. So it's just an interesting conflict of visions that's arising here. I don't know exactly what the motivation behind them publishing this is, but there's clearly something at work. They're even reporting, this is shocking, on the corruption and aid misallocation allegations using inside sources. So in recent months, the issue of corruption has strained Zelensky's relationship with many of his allies. Amid all the pressure to root out corruption, I assumed, perhaps naively, that officials in Ukraine would think twice before taking a bribe or pocketing state funds. But when I made this point out to a top presidential advisor in early October, he asked me to turn off my audio recorder so he could speak more freely. And then obviously he just ran his comments anyway. Simon, you're mistaken, he says. People are stealing like there's no tomorrow. When I asked Zelensky about the problem, he acknowledged its gravity and the threat it poses to Ukraine's morale and its relationships with foreign partners. He also suggested that some foreign allies have an incentive to exaggerate the problem because it gives them an excuse to cut off financial support. It's not right, he says, for them to cover up their failure to help Ukraine by tossing out these accusations. So notice the way that Zelensky frames it. He doesn't deny that it's happening. He doesn't deny that it's a problem. He doesn't discuss scale. He just says it's unfortunate that it is happening because it's making our partners not see us as a legitimate party to support. And it's obviously Russian disinformation that's blowing up the scale of the corruption. Well, you're not forthcoming about the scale, so why do you wonder about speculation?
I'm not that worried about the corruption, to be honest, from a geopolitical standpoint. Like, it's terrible and it will only get worse. Coming back from Poland, everyone there in serious positions knows that Ukraine's unbelievably corrupt. And future aid will just have to come through Polish companies working in Ukraine because they can't give the money to Ukrainian companies. You're just burning it. It's a waste of time. But that means that there's no real reason to try and fix the corruption from anyone.
So it just means that why are we throwing our money at an obviously corrupt system?
Well, if you want to send it and support the Ukrainian cause, you would do it through Poland or Romania or some other country in the region that could be a conduit, which you could sue if they steal all the money. Whereas if you give it to a Ukrainian company, good luck.
But then, obviously, if your goal were to be a peaceful resolution rather than just total one side or the other victory, which I know a lot of people that are funding Ukraine, it is total Ukrainian victory, then funding them through a proxy country makes it seem like they are in NATO in all but name, and therefore the war is just going to continue on.
Well, they are in NATO, but all but name.
I agree. But this is the issue of if you're trying to get the Russians and the Ukrainians to the negotiating table, again, the elites aren't, then that's going to distance it.
That's my point. I don't think anyone actually wants negotiation. People in power. I mean, this is actually great for Eastern Europe because it gets rid of a big rival, which was the Ukrainian state. It's good for Europe in general to keep the Russians in a position that's away from us. It's good for Washington because they get to destroy Russia. And for the Russians, what reason is there to negotiate with Kiev? It's like, no, we want to take more land if we can. Otherwise, we can just sit here forever. Russia is politically a weird place, but they're not exactly going to collapse for all the strange stuff that happens occasionally, in which case they can sit and wait. I don't know if Kiev can, but good luck.
Yeah, and I don't think with our precarious debt-based economy and our lack of material resources doubling down on renewables as our energy strategy, we can really afford to continue it anyway. But again, suicidal elites that aren't connected to the consequences of their actions. It's not just Time magazine as well. There was a recent report from the Washington Post that confirmed one of those conspiracy theories about the demolition of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. They're just reporting the Ukrainians were in on it. So this is Roman Chavinsky, I hope I pronounced that correctly, you would know, decorated 48-year-old colonel who served in Ukraine's Special Operations Forces, was the coordinator of the Nord Stream operation. People familiar with his role said. Now, of course, they use that line all the time for the Trump administration. It might have just been some homeless man sleeping on the street outside a congressional office in those days. So you never know the legitimacy of the source. But the fact that they're even running this headline means that it's reputational damage to the Ukrainians when the line before was, how could Russia possibly blow up their own pipeline? Putin's clearly a madman, etc.
Well, that's the good thing, really, is that you're able to now talk about the failures of the Ukrainian state. I mean, there was a period where you could only speak praise in the mainstream media. They're now able to, well, say the bare minimum, which is, yeah, you're corrupt. Here's where you probably engaged in an act of terrorism, blowing up the Nord Stream pipeline. I mean, we get why. It's a great geopolitical move, don't get me wrong. Everyone can see the logistics behind it, but why sit here and be like, yeah, the Russians did that? No one believes that.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but the idea wasn't that Ukraine was not corrupt, but the question was the trajectory it would follow. So the way I was listening to the narrative, few people would say that Ukraine was not a corrupt state, but they would say that the Ukrainians want to be closer to Europe, which would trigger a procedure of, let's say, lowering corruption.
Sure, I'm just getting more to the point of the here and now.
Yeah.
In which there was a period in which even talking about the fact that if you were sending money there, it was largely going to disappear into a black hole, wasn't even allowed to be discussed.
Well, as well, if you were saying actually it was unwise for NATO to creep up to Russia's borders because you would have provoked Russia, and we know that Russia are volatile. Like, if you said that as an assessment, you'd immediately be called a Putin apologist. Yeah. So if you suggested that the Ukrainians were very corrupt, that there was anything untoward about the US State Department's involvement in the deposing of the former leader in 2014, you were called a conspiracy theorist. And so, yeah, reasonable people would have said, this is not a bastion of democracy. But the elite messaging was very much, Ukraine is unscrutable. We are handing all of your money over to protect democracy, which is mad, which is just not true. So Chavinsky actually denied this through his attorney. All speculations about my involvement in the attack on the Nord Stream are being spread by Russian propaganda without any basis.
Oh, shut up.
Yes, Russian propaganda from the Washington Post, who formerly were the spearhead of accusing Donald Trump of working with the Russians. Right. He said in a written statement to the Washington Post and Der Spiegel, who conducted the joint investigation, Chavinsky's participation in Nord Stream bombing contradicts Zelensky's public denials that his country was involved. Quote, I am president and I give orders accordingly, Zelensky said in a press interview in June, responding to a report by the Post that the US Central Intelligence Agency had learned of Ukraine's plans before the attack. This is also something that Dan and I covered in a segment quite a while ago. Nothing of the sort has been done in Ukraine. I would never act that way, Zelensky said. But the Nord Stream operation was designed to keep Zelensky out of the loop. People familiar with the operation had said. So the interesting reading there as well is not just the press have fallen out of favor with Zelensky, but are his own government going around him and taking other actions that he's not aware of because they think that his private and publicly stated narrative of total victory is unlikely on the current course of action?
I don't know about that. It could also just be, it's best that you not know. We need you not to know. That happens in government a lot. If you're going to blow up Nord Stream, probably best not to tell the president, and that way he can deny it.
I suppose so.
I'm just thinking, yes, Minister.
Yeah, no, you're not wrong. I was thinking more of the sort of Trump administration when the military officials told him we'd withdrawn from Syria completely, and they actually stationed a few hundred troops there still. And so they just went around because they thought the commander-in-chief wasn't making competent decisions. So, but the fact that we're even raising that question means that there are cracks in the Ukraine narrative. Things aren't going as well as everyone in the elite had already said. It's actually the conspiracy theorists who are proved right. And so now you've even got Konstantin Kisin turning around and saying, it's time to end the war. Konstantin, given his Russian heritage, has been very vocal on his pro-Ukraine support. He's debated Peter Hitchens, on this. And if even he's coming out and saying now there's no reasonable prospect of a Ukrainian total victory, we need to look into peaceful solutions, it's becoming a mainstream position.
It is definitely true that the rabid support for the Ukrainian state in the West, that has been completely eroded. That basically doesn't exist, as you're demonstrating. Even in places such as Constantine, it was like, send them all aid we can to help them get a better peace. if he's given up, the Times has given up, the Washington Post has given up, definitely that rabid support is now gone. And what's left exactly? A West that maybe wants to give more money, but how much more?
Well, they want to give money somewhere. This is a visual representation. Now, this was a fake video for everyone that needs to know. It was a deep fake. Politico have fact-checked it, but it is representative of what's happened. This was a fake Times Square billboard where the Ukrainian flag and Stand With Ukraine has been nudged out by the Israeli flag and Stand With Israel. And that's basically what's happened. And I think one of the reasons for that is the narrative power of the Second World War is more powerful than the Cold War, particularly for conservatives and liberals who have been beaten with your mid-century German stick for so long that actually preserving the lives of Jews against anti-Semitism and total destruction by Hamas means there's more narrative driving force that moves a defense of that. And so Ukraine has just taken a subordinate backseat in the public consciousness.
I think that's also important to tie it with the actions of EU with regard to digital freedom of speech and protection of speech.
Right.
Because by showing this, that you are not allowed to say this, but now you can. A few years ago, you have a very good argument against the disinformation wars that the EU is conducting with this Breton fellow.
I mean, I appreciate your theory about the fact that obviously Israel's more important to the West than Ukraine is. That is true. But one of the things I found in Russia, and I think this probably explains it better, is that part of the Russian strategy, like a few months ago when I was there, is that we'll just wait. The West gets distracted with some other thing eventually. They know how we operate, and it's true that the current thing meme, as kind of inaccurate as it can be sometimes, is true that the West operates on kind of amnesia, where we just jump from subject to subject every 6 months, and I mean international big subject that we're obsessed with, and then we just kind of get bored with it and move on. And the Russians I met in Donbass and in mainland Russia both know that that is a problem the West has. I mean, the Chinese talk about it a lot with Taiwan. Just wait. If you just wait it out, the Western world just moves on to something else.
They have multi-decade plans and unwavering conviction in their own sense of national belonging, whereas we are a very globally monocultural, very online political climate, and that means that we're more liable to grand-scale capture, moving from COVID to Ukraine to Israel to climate change in future, I suppose.
But they are also in government for multi-decades.
Yeah.
They're elite.
That's also
That's
part of it. Yeah. So I suppose I'll wrap that up there with so long Ukraine, hello war in the Middle East, and I look forward to the next current thing.
If you appreciated that episode from the podcast of the Lotus Eaters, you can go to lotuseaters.com to get access to all the premium content that's on the site, such as the premium videos, this one on the politics of Life is Strange. If you'd like to find out what else is being put out, you can follow on Twitter at lotuseaters_com on Twitter. Thank you and goodbye.